Every woman dreams of her wedding day, but for Freyda it became her worst nightmare. Standing before two gathered clans in ancient Langfjord, she watched her betrothed look her up and down with pure disgust. "I will not wed that," Sigmund of Hov announced loudly, his rejection echoing across the stunned crowd. The shame was unbearable. Her father's alliance crumbled in an instant. But then something unexpected happened. From the back of the crowd, Halvar the blacksmith stepped forward. This poor, humble man had loved her since childhood. "Then I will take her," he said simply. "If she'll have me." The crowd gasped. Here was a man who saw her worth when nobility saw only flaws. But would Freyda choose love over status? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like a shroud, and in the great hall of Jarl Eric's longhouse, preparations for his daughter's wedding had begun before dawn. Freyda stood at her chamber window, watching the servants scurry below like ants preparing for winter. Her hands trembled as she traced the intricate silver threads woven into her red wedding gown, the same gown her grandmother had worn, and her great-grandmother before that. The fabric held the weight of generations, each woman who had donned it carrying forward the hopes and burdens of their bloodline. At 23, Freyda was considered past her prime for marriage, a fact whispered behind cupped hands throughout Langfjord. Her father had tried to arrange matches for years, but each potential suitor found excuse after excuse to withdraw their offer. Too heavy, they said, not comely enough for their station. The words cut deeper each time, until Freyda learned to expect rejection, like the changing of seasons. But this marriage to Sigmund of Hov was different. It wasn't about love or even attraction. It was about survival. 2 years of failed harvests had weakened Eric's clan, and the Hov possessed the largest grain stores in the region. This union would secure food for the coming winter and cement an alliance that could protect both clans from the growing threats of rival chieftains and Danish raiders who prowled the northern seas with increasing boldness. Freyda's mother, Astrid, entered the chamber carrying a wooden box carved with ravens and wolves. Her face bore the weathered beauty of a woman who had seen 4 decades of harsh winters and harder choices. She set the box on the wooden table and lifted the lid, revealing the family's most precious heirloom, a silver arm ring passed down through 7 generations of jarls. "This belonged to your great-great-grandmother, Veldis the Wise," Astrid said, her voice carrying the reverence reserved for ancient stories told by firelight. She wore it when she married Jarl Thorvald and brought peace between the mountain clans and the coastal settlements. Today you carry on that tradition. Freyda lifted the arm ring, feeling its considerable weight. The silver was old, darkened with age, but the runic inscriptions remained clear. Strength in unity, wisdom in sacrifice. She understood the message. Her personal desires mattered less than the welfare of her people. Yet as she slipped the ring over her wrist, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was donning shackles rather than jewelry. "Tell me about him again," Freyda requested, though she had heard the description many times. Sometimes repetition made difficult truths more bearable. Astrid's expression softened with something approaching sympathy. "Sigmund is young, strong, and wealthy. His father controls more land than any jarl within 3 days' ride. He has proven himself in battle against the Danes and shows promise as a leader." What her mother didn't say, but what they both knew, was that Sigmund was also renowned for his pride and quick temper. Stories reached even their remote settlement about his treatment of servants and his dismissive attitude toward those he deemed beneath his station. But desperate times called for difficult alliances. A commotion outside drew their attention to the window. The first guests were arriving, a mix of Eric's sworn men and their families, along with representatives from smaller clans hoping to witness this historic union. Freyda spotted old Magnus the Skald leaning heavily on his carved walking stick, no doubt preparing to compose verses about the day's events. Children darted between the adults, their excited laughter carrying on the morning air. Near the blacksmith's forge, smoke rose in steady plumes as Halvar worked his bellows. Even from this distance, Freyda could make out his broad shoulders moving with practiced rhythm. She'd known him since childhood, the smith's son, who had always been kind to her when other children whispered cruel names. While the noble boys learned swordplay and hunting, Halvar had mastered the ancient art of shaping iron and steel, in coaxing useful tools and deadly weapons from raw metal through patience and skill. "You're watching him again," Astrid observed. Following her daughter's gaze, Freyda felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I know what you were doing." Her mother's tone held no judgment, only the weary understanding of a woman who had once been young herself. "But today you must put aside such thoughts. Your duty lies elsewhere." The word duty settled over Freyda like a heavy cloak. She had been raised on stories of strong women who sacrificed personal happiness for the greater good. Her own mother had married for alliance rather than love, trading her youthful dreams for the security and status of being a jarl's wife. It was the natural order of things, as unchangeable as the tide. A horn sounded from the eastern approach. The Hov delegation was arriving. Freyda's heart began to pound as she watched the procession of horses and wagons wind down the hillside path. Banners bearing the Hov symbol, a golden bear on a field of blue, snapped in the morning breeze. At the head of the column rode Jarl Gunnar of Hov, a grizzled warrior whose reputation for cunning in both battle and negotiation was legendary. Beside him rode his son Sigmund, resplendent in a blue cloak trimmed with fur and silver. Even at this distance, Sigmund cut an impressive figure. Tall and broad-shouldered, he sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to command. His fair hair caught the sunlight like spun gold, and his bearing spoke of privilege and power. Freyda tried to feel something: excitement, attraction, even nervousness would be better than the hollow resignation that filled her chest. "He's handsome," Astrid offered, as if reading her thoughts. "Yes," Freyda agreed, though the word felt like ash in her mouth. The servants had transformed the great hall into something approaching magnificence. Fresh rushes covered the floor, scented with herbs to mask the usual odors of smoke, dogs, and unwashed bodies. Tapestries depicting great hunts and battle victories hung from the rafters, and tables groaned under the weight of the finest feast Eric's household could provide. Whole roasted pigs, haunches of venison, wheels of aged cheese, and barrels of mead and ale. Enough food to feed the assembled guests and cement the image of prosperity that this alliance desperately needed to project. Freyda made her way downstairs, her red gown rustling against the worn wooden steps. The hall buzzed with conversation as guests found their places according to strict social hierarchy. Jarls and their immediate families occupied the high table, while farmers, craftsmen, and servants arranged themselves in descending order of importance. The separation was absolute and understood by all. Her father, Eric, stood near the great hearth, deep in conversation with several of his most trusted advisors. At 45, he remained an imposing figure, despite the grey threading through his beard and the slight stoop that spoke of old battle wounds. When he spotted Freyda, his expression brightened with genuine paternal pride. "My daughter," he called, opening his arms to embrace her. "You look magnificent. Your grandmother would be proud to see you wearing her gown." Freyda accepted his embrace, breathing in the familiar sense of leather, steel, and the pine soap he favored. For a moment, she felt like a child again, safe in her father's protective circle. But the illusion passed quickly as she saw the strain around his eyes, the worry lines that had deepened over the past months of negotiations and preparation. "Are you ready for this, my child?" Eric asked quietly, his hands resting on her shoulders. The question carried layers of meaning. Was she ready to leave her childhood home? Ready to become wife to a man she barely knew? Ready to shoulder the responsibility of securing her clan's future through her marriage? Ready to set aside her own dreams in service of duty? "I am ready, father," she replied, and was surprised to find she meant it. Not because she felt any enthusiasm for what lay ahead, but because she had finally accepted the inevitability of her fate. A second horn blast announced that the formal ceremonies could begin. Eric offered his arm, and together they walked toward the great doors where Jarl Gunnar and his son waited. The assembled guests fell silent, understanding they were about to witness something that would be remembered and retold for generations. Outside, a wooden arch had been erected and decorated with late autumn flowers, purple heather, yellow gorse, and bright red rowan berries. The symbolism was ancient and deliberate: heather for good fortune, gorse for endurance through hardship, and rowan for protection against evil spirits. Two young girls, daughters of Eric's bondsman, stood ready to scatter flower petals as Freyda approached. Jarl Gunnar proved to be everything the stories suggested: silver-haired but vigorous, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to catalogue and evaluate everything they saw. His handshake with Eric was firm, his smile warm but calculating. This was a man who had built his power through careful alliances and strategic marriages, and this union represented another piece in his long game of regional influence. Sigmund dismounted from his horse with fluid grace, his expensive clothing and silver arm rings marking him as nobility of the highest order. Up close, his handsomeness was undeniable: strong jaw, piercing green eyes, and the kind of confident bearing that commanded attention. He should have been everything a young woman could desire in a husband. When his gaze fell upon Freyda, however, something shifted in his expression. The polite smile faltered for just a moment, replaced by something that might have been disappointment or even disgust before the social mask reasserted itself. In that brief instant, Freyda knew with sinking certainty that this day would not unfold as anyone had planned. The ritual words had been spoken, the ancient oaths recited, and the moment of truth arrived with the weight of inevitability. Magnus the Skald stepped forward, his weathered voice carrying across the gathered assembly as he began the ceremonial binding. The crowd pressed closer, sensing they were about to witness something that would be spoken of for years to come. "Before the gods, and before this assembly," Magnus intoned, "let the bride and groom step forward to claim their destiny." Freyda's legs felt like water as she moved beneath the flowered arch. Her red gown, so carefully prepared, now seemed to weigh as much as a coat of mail. The silver arm ring pressed against her wrist, a cold reminder of the generations of women who had stood in similar moments, sacrificing personal desire for clan survival. Behind her, she could hear the whispered conversations die away as 200 pairs of eyes focused on the ceremony. Eric's hand found her elbow, steadying her as they approached the arch where Sigmund waited. The young Jarl stood with his father, both men presenting the image of nobility and power that this alliance was meant to secure. Gunnar's expression remained neutral, businesslike. This was politics, after all, not romance. But as Freyda drew closer, she noticed something unsettling in Sigmund's face. His green eyes swept over her form with unconcealed evaluation, like a farmer assessing livestock at market. She saw him take in her fuller figure, the way the red gown emphasized rather than concealed her curves, and watched his jaw tighten with what could only be disappointment. The polite mask he had worn during the initial greetings was slipping away, replaced by something harder and more honest. "Freyda Eric's daughter," Magnus announced, "daughter of the mountain wolf, keeper of the ancient bloodlines. Step forward to meet your destined husband." The words that should have filled her with pride instead felt like weights, dragging her toward an inevitable doom. She forced herself to walk with dignity, chin raised, shoulders straight. Whatever happened, she would not shame her father or her lineage by showing weakness. Sigmund's expression grew darker with each step she took. By the time she reached the arch, his revulsion was barely concealed. The assembled crowd began to sense something amiss. Conversations resumed in hushed, worried tones, and she caught sight of her father's concerned frown from the corner of her eye. Magnus continued with the ancient words, his voice carrying the weight of tradition that bound all Viking marriages. "Sigmund Gunnarsson, son of the Golden Bear, proven in battle, rich in silver, do you take this woman as your wife before gods and men?" The silence stretched like a bowstring drawn taut. Freyda felt her heart hammering against her ribs as every person present leaned forward. waiting for the words that would seal their union and secure the future of both clans. Instead, Sigmund's face twisted with undisguised contempt. He looked her up and down once more, his green eyes cold as winter seas, and when he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the stunned assembly. "I will not wed that." The words hit Freyda like a physical blow. She felt the color drain from her face as gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone's sharp intake of breath sounded unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. Children stopped their playing, sensing the adult tension, even if they couldn't understand its source. "I came here expecting a wife worthy of my station," Sigmund continued, his voice growing louder and more cruel with each word. "Not some fat sow dressed in silk. Look at her. She can barely fit in that ancient gown. Do you truly expect me to take such a creature to my bed? To sire children from such stock?" Each word landed like a hammer blow. Freyda felt her knees buckle slightly, and only her desperate grip on dignity kept her from collapsing entirely. The shame was overwhelming, not just for herself, but for her father, her clan, everyone who had invested hope in this moment. Eric's roar of rage broke the terrible silence. "You dare insult my daughter? After the agreements we made, the oaths we swore." Gunnar placed a restraining hand on his son's arm, his political instincts recognizing disaster in the making. "Sigmund, perhaps we should—" "No, father." Sigmund shook off the restraining hand, his young pride and cruelty on full display. "I will not be bound to damaged goods. Find me a proper wife, one who won't shame me before my own people." The crowd erupted in angry voices. Eric's sworn men reached for their weapons, while Gunnar's retinue tensed in response. What had been a celebration was rapidly transforming into something that could end in bloodshed. Years of careful negotiation crumbled in the face of one young man's thoughtless brutality. Freyda stood frozen beneath the flowered arch, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of the disaster unfolding around her. The red gown that had once symbolized hope and tradition now felt like a mockery, marking her as the failed bride who couldn't even secure her own betrothal. The silver arm ring seemed to burn against her wrist, a reminder of all the strong women who had come before her, and how she had proved unworthy of their legacy. Through the haze of humiliation, she became aware of movement at the back of the crowd. The assembled guests were parting, creating a path for someone walking forward with quiet determination. Conversations died away as people turned to see who would dare interrupt such a moment of high tension. Halvar emerged from the crowd, still wearing his leather apron stained with ash and metal filings. His dark hair was tousled from work, his clothes simple and practical rather than ceremonial. Against the backdrop of silk-clad nobles and elaborately dressed guests, he looked like exactly what he was, a working man, a craftsman whose hands bore the honest scars of his trade. But there was something in his bearing that commanded attention. He walked with purpose, his brown eyes fixed not on the arguing jarls or the nervous crowd, but on Freyda herself. In his gaze she saw something she had almost forgotten existed, simple, uncomplicated kindness. "Then I will," he said, his voice cutting through the angry conversations with surprising clarity. "If she'll have me." The second shock of the day rippled through the assembly. This was beyond unprecedented. It was scandalous. A blacksmith's son offering to marry a jarl's daughter was so far outside the normal social order that many of the guests seemed unable to process what they had heard. Sigmund's lip curled with amusement at what he clearly saw as an absurd joke. "You, a soot-covered smith, thinks to take what I refuse? Your father shoes my horse's boy? Know your place!" Halvar's expression remained steady, unimpressed by the insult. "My place is wherever honor calls me, and honor calls me to offer marriage to a woman who deserves better than cruelty on what should be her most joyful day." He stepped closer to Freyda, his eyes never leaving hers. In them she saw reflected not the image others held of her, too heavy, unmarriageable, a burden to be endured, but something entirely different. She saw herself as she had been years ago, when they were children, sharing bread beside his father's forge, laughing at simple jokes and talking about dreams that seemed possible then. Freyda Eriksdotter, he said formally, though his voice carried warmth that no amount of ceremony could disguise. "I am not rich. I cannot offer you silver or land or political alliance, but I can offer you respect, kindness, and a love that sees your true worth. Will you consider accepting my hand?" The crowd held its collective breath. This was a moment that would reshape not just individual lives, but the social fabric of their entire community. A jarl's daughter choosing a blacksmith over nobility would set a precedent that challenged everything they thought they understood about duty, status, and the proper order of things. Freyda looked into Halvar's honest face and felt something shift in her chest. The shame began to transform into something else, not defiance exactly, but a quiet recognition of choice. For the first time in her life, someone was asking what she wanted, rather than telling her what she must do. The question hung in the air between them, pregnant with possibility and heavy with consequence. The silence stretched like a held breath as Freyda stared into Halvar's earnest face. Around them, the crowd waited with the kind of hushed anticipation usually reserved for the moments before battle. She could feel the weight of every gaze, the pressure of a decision that would ripple through their community for generations to come. Her father's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "This is madness," Eric declared, though his tone carried more bewilderment than anger. "Halvar, son of Bjorn, you are a good man and a skilled craftsman. But you cannot simply—" "With respect, Jarl Eric," Halvar interrupted, never taking his eyes from Freyda's face, "I can offer what your daughter deserves, a husband who values her for who she is, not what political advantage she might bring." Sigmund's laughter rang harsh and mocking across the assembly. "Listen to this fool speak of love like some traveling minstrel. Marriage is about bloodlines, alliances, the joining of worthy houses. What could a blacksmith possibly understand about such matters?" "I understand enough to know that cruelty has no place at a wedding," Halvar replied quietly. "And I know that a woman's worth isn't measured by her ability to fit into clothes made for someone else's body." His words struck home with devastating accuracy. Freyda felt tears threaten at the corners of her eyes, not from shame this time, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen, truly seen, by someone who didn't find her lacking. Gunnar stepped forward, his political instincts sensing opportunity amid the chaos. "Perhaps we should consider this development more carefully," he said, his voice carrying the smooth calculation of a man accustomed to finding advantage in unexpected circumstances. "If the bride chooses to accept this alternative arrangement, it would resolve certain complications that have arisen." The older Jarl's meaning was clear to everyone present. Sigmund's public rejection had already damaged the carefully negotiated alliance. If Freyda married someone else, anyone else, it would allow both clans to save face while quietly abandoning a union that had become politically toxic. "You would permit this?" Eric asked, his voice heavy with the weight of implications he was still processing. "I would permit my daughter to choose her own happiness," came a new voice. Astrid had moved through the crowd to stand beside her husband, her expression set with quiet determination. "She has spent her life serving the needs of others. Perhaps it's time she served her own." The statement sent another ripple of shock through the assembly. For a Jarl's wife to publicly support such a radical departure from tradition was almost as scandalous as the proposal itself. But Astrid's words carried the authority of a woman who had herself sacrificed personal desires for duty, and who perhaps regretted the choices that had brought them to this moment. Freyda felt the silver arm ring pulse against her wrist like a heartbeat. 7 generations of women had worn it, each one accepting the burden of marriage for alliance. But perhaps strength could take different forms. Perhaps wisdom sometimes lay in breaking with tradition rather than blindly following it. She looked around the circle of faces, her father's worried concern, her mother's encouraging nod, Sigmund's sneering contempt, Gunnar's calculating interest. But it was Halvar's patient waiting that decided her. He wasn't pressuring or demanding. He was simply offering, willing to accept whatever answer she gave. she began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was about to say. The words felt too large for her throat, too heavy for her tongue. "Take your time," Halvar said gently. "This is not a decision to be made in haste." Magnus the Scald stepped forward, his ancient voice carrying the weight of tradition and law. "If the bride wishes to consider this offer, it is her right under the old customs. A woman cannot be forced into marriage against her will, though she may be strongly encouraged." The last words carried a dry humor that drew nervous chuckles from some of the crowd. Magnus had overseen hundreds of weddings in his long life, but this was clearly a first even for him. Freyda closed her eyes and tried to imagine two different futures stretching before her. In one, she accepted social disgrace, married beneath her station, lived simply in a blacksmith's house but with kindness and respect. In the other, she somehow salvaged this disaster, perhaps found another political marriage, continued the pattern of duty and sacrifice that had defined every woman in her bloodline. When she opened her eyes, her decision was clear. "Halvar Bjornsson," she said, her voice carrying more strongly than she had expected. "I accept your offer." The words seemed to hit the crowd like a physical force. Gasps, exclamations, and urgent whispered conversations erupted across the assembly. Several of Eric's bondsmen looked as though they were witnessing the end of the world, while some of the younger women in the crowd wore expressions of shocked admiration. Sigmund's face flushed red with a mixture of anger and wounded pride. "You would choose this peasant over me? Over everything I could have given you?" "You gave me nothing but insults," Freyda replied, finding strength she didn't know she possessed. "He offers me respect. The choice seems clear." Eric ran a hand through his graying hair, the gesture of a man trying to process a day that had departed entirely from his expectations. "Daughter, are you certain?" Once spoken, such words cannot be easily taken back. "I am certain, father." And surprisingly, she was. For the first time in years, she felt as though she was making a choice based on her own desires rather than everyone else's needs. Halvar stepped closer. Close enough that she could smell the familiar scents of his work, iron, charcoal, and the particular heat that clung to anyone who spent their days working a forge. "Then, if Magnus the Scald is willing, perhaps we might complete what was begun here today." Magnus looked to Eric, who after a long moment gave a slow nod. "If this is truly my daughter's choice, then I will not stand against it. Though I confess I never imagined her wedding day would unfold quite like this." "Nor did I," Astrid added, but her voice carried warmth rather than disapproval. "But perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing." Gunnar stepped forward, his expression businesslike, despite the chaos surrounding them. "This leaves certain practical matters unresolved. The alliance between our houses will need to be renegotiated," Eric finished. "But not today. Today belongs to the bride and groom, whoever they might be." As the crowd began to reorganize itself around this unexpected turn of events, Freyda caught sight of several faces in the assembly. Old Magnus looked delighted. This would make a story worth telling for decades. Some of the older women nodded approval, perhaps remembering their own moments of choosing duty over desire. The younger men seemed split between admiration for Halvar's boldness and concern about the precedent being set. But it was the children who seemed to understand most clearly what was happening. They watched with bright, curious eyes, absorbing a lesson about the possibility of choosing love over expectation, kindness over status. Whatever complications this day might create, it was also teaching them that sometimes the most important choices were the ones that challenged everything they thought. They knew about how the world worked. The wedding ceremony that followed bore little resemblance to the elaborate affair that had been planned. With Sigmund and his father's retinue departing in barely concealed fury, the gathering had shrunk to Eric's people and a handful of neighboring farmers who had traveled to witness what they assumed would be a standard political alliance. Instead, they found themselves part of something unprecedented. A Jarl's daughter choosing love over station, Magnus the Scald, clearly energized by the unexpected turn of events. took charge of the abbreviated ceremony with the enthusiasm of a man who had just been handed the greatest story of his career. His weathered hands gestured as he called upon the ancient gods to witness this most unusual union. Odin All-Father, who traded his eye for wisdom, Magnus intoned. Look upon these two who choose their own path. Thor, Thunderer, who protects the brave, shield this couple from those who would question their courage. Freyda, goddess of love, bless this match born not of politics but of the heart. Halvar had retrieved a simple iron ring from his workshop, not the elaborate silver band that had been prepared for Sigmund, but a circle of metal he had forged himself, polished smooth and strong. As he slipped it onto Freyda's finger, she felt its weight and warmth, so different from the cold silver that marked her inherited obligations. This ring is made from iron drawn from our own mountains, Halvar said quietly. His words meant for her alone, though the crowd strained to hear. It will not tarnish or break, and neither will my promise to honor you for all the days of my life. Freyda looked down at the simple band, then back into his steady brown eyes. And I promise to stand beside you. Whatever challenges our choice may bring, the kiss that sealed their union was gentle, respectful, nothing like the passionate displays she had heard described in other wedding stories. But it carried something more valuable, genuine affection between two people who truly saw each other. When they separated, Freyda noticed that several women in the crowd were wiping away tears. The feast that followed was awkward but determined. Eric's household servants, working with the efficiency born of long practice, quickly reorganized the tables and distributed food that had been prepared for twice as many guests. The absence of the Hov delegation left empty spaces that everyone pretended not to notice, while conversations carefully avoided the political implications of what had just occurred. Freyda found herself seated beside her new husband at a table that felt both too large and too small for the occasion. Halvar ate with the quiet manners of a man comfortable with himself, making no effort to impress anyone with false sophistication. When he spoke, it was with thoughtfulness rather than the quick wit or boastful stories that usually marked wedding celebrations. "Are you having second thoughts?" he asked quietly, during a lull in the surrounding conversations. The question was so direct, so honestly concerned, that it took her a moment to respond. "Should I be? I hope not. But I would understand if you were." He set down his eating knife and turned to face her more fully. "What we've done today will create complications neither of us can fully foresee. Some people will never forgive us for challenging the way things have always been done." Freyda glanced around the hall, noting the clusters of conversation and the occasional glances thrown in their direction. She could read the emotions on various faces: confusion, disapproval, curiosity, and in a few cases, something that might have been admiration. "My father looks like a man trying to solve a riddle, with half the pieces missing. Mine looks like he's wondering whether to be proud or terrified." Halvar nodded toward the far end of the hall, where Bjorn the smith sat with several other craftsmen, his weathered face cycling through expressions of bewilderment and concern. Eric rose from his seat at the high table, calling for silence with the authority of long leadership. The conversations died away as all eyes turned toward the Jarl, waiting for some word that might help them understand what this day meant for their community. "Today has brought surprises none of us expected," Eric began, his voice carrying the careful diplomacy of a man walking across thin ice. "My daughter has made choices that challenge our customs and expectations, but she has also chosen to follow her heart rather than merely her duty, and that requires its own kind of courage." He paused, looking directly at Freyda and Halvar. "The alliance we sought with the Hov clan must now be pursued through other means. This will require careful negotiation and perhaps some difficult decisions in the months ahead. But today is not for worry about tomorrow's challenges. Today, we celebrate the union of two people who have chosen each other freely." The response was polite rather than enthusiastic, but it was acceptance of a sort. Several voices called out traditional wedding blessings, and Magnus began composing verses, that would preserve this day in the community's collective memory. As the evening progressed, Freyda noticed the subtle ways their choice was already reshaping social dynamics. Some of the younger women seemed emboldened to speak more freely with men outside their usual social circles. A few of the craftsmen carried themselves with slightly more pride, as if Halvar's elevation had somehow elevated their own status. But she also saw the worried expressions of those who depended on traditional hierarchies for their own security and influence. Bjorn the smith approached their table as the formal feast wound down, his massive hands twisting his cap nervously. Despite his skill at the forge, social situations clearly made him uncomfortable, especially when his son was now married to a jarl's daughter. "Begging your pardon, Lady Freyda," he said, the title sitting awkwardly on his tongue. "I wanted to say that Halvar is a good boy, man I mean. He's worked hard since he was old enough to hold the bellows, and he's never brought shame to our family name." "I'm sure he hasn't," Freyda replied gently. "And please just call me Freyda. We're family now." The simple statement seemed to overwhelm the old smith, who nodded repeatedly before retreating to the safety of his own table. But the exchange illustrated another complexity they would need to navigate: how to blend two very different social worlds without losing the best of either. As the celebration began to wind down, servants clearing away dishes and guests beginning to drift toward their homes or sleeping arrangements, Freyda felt the weight of what lay ahead settling upon her shoulders. The wedding was complete, but their real journey was just beginning. Tomorrow would bring questions about where they would live, how they would support themselves, and what role she would play in a community that no longer quite knew how to categorize her. But tonight, she was simply a newly married woman sitting beside a good man who had chosen to stand with her when no one else would. For now, that felt like enough. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding that reshaped Langfjord's social landscape, and Freyda was learning that choosing love over duty brought its own unique set of challenges. She stood in the doorway of what was now her home, a modest stone cottage, beside the forge, where the smell of charcoal and heated metal had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. The transition from jarl's daughter to blacksmith's wife proved more complicated than either she or Halvar had anticipated. The cottage that had seemed cozy during their brief courtship now felt cramped when filled with the possessions she had brought from her father's hall. Her elaborate gowns hung beside Halvar's simple tunics, like exotic birds in a sparrow's nest, beautiful but entirely out of place. More challenging still were the subtle changes in how people treated her. The formal deference she had once taken for granted had evaporated overnight. Market vendors who had once competed for her favor now treated her with the friendly equality reserved for other craftsmen's wives. Some days this felt liberating. She could walk through the settlement without the burden of constant observation and judgment. Other days, she mourned the loss of the respect that had come with her father's name and position. Halvar worked to accommodate her presence with the same thoughtful consideration he had shown during their brief courtship. He had expanded the cottage's single sleeping chamber and built additional storage for her belongings. When he noticed her struggling with the rougher fabrics that suited a working household, he quietly acquired softer wool and linen without making her feel ashamed of her preferences. But their most significant challenge came from an unexpected source: Freyda's own lack of practical skills. She had been raised to manage servants, oversee household accounts, and navigate complex social situations. She could read and write, unusual skills for a woman in their community, and she understood politics, trade negotiations, and the intricate web of alliances that kept their region stable. What she couldn't do was cook a simple meal without burning it, mend clothes without pricking her fingers bloody, or manage the countless small tasks that kept a working household functioning. The morning brought another humbling lesson as Freyda attempted to prepare breakfast while Halvar worked the early fire in his forge. She had watched servants perform these tasks thousands of times, but observation proved a poor substitute for experience. The porridge scorched while she struggled with unfamiliar measurements. and the bread she had attempted to bake the previous evening had emerged from the small oven as dense as stone. Perhaps I should focus on other contributions to our household, she said ruefully, as Halvar examined the charred remains of what was supposed to be their morning meal. He tasted the porridge with the courage of a man facing battle, then set down his spoon with diplomatic care. The burned bits add an interesting flavor, he offered, though his expression suggested otherwise. You don't need to spare my feelings, Freyda said, laughing despite her frustration. I know it's terrible. My mother tried to teach me household management, but somehow that never included actually doing the work myself. Halvar's face grew thoughtful as he considered this. You know, there might be a different way to approach this problem. Your skills aren't wrong. They're just different from what our household currently needs. Over the following days, they began to discover how Freyda's noble education could serve their new life together. Her ability to read and calculate numbers proved invaluable when dealing with customers who tried to cheat the illiterate blacksmith. Her understanding of social dynamics helped Halvar navigate increasingly complex relationships with clients whose attitudes toward him had shifted since his marriage. More importantly, her connections within the community opened new opportunities for the forge. Word spread that the Jarl's daughter could negotiate contracts and resolve disputes with a sophistication that impressed even seasoned traders. Soon, Halvar found himself receiving commissions from distant settlements, whose leaders had heard about the blacksmith whose wife could document agreements in written form and ensure fair treatment for all parties. The arrangement that emerged felt natural and complementary. Halvar worked the forge, creating tools, weapons, and decorative items with increasing skill and reputation. Freyda managed the business side, negotiating prices, maintaining records, and using her noble connections to expand their client base. Together, they were building something neither could have achieved alone, but their success created new tensions within the community. Some of the established merchants resented the competition from what they saw as an upstart forge, trading on noble connections. A few of Eric's traditional supporters worried about the precedent being set. If the Jarl's daughter could abandon her station for love, what prevented others from questioning the established order? These concerns came to a head during the autumn market gathering when Gunvor the Weaver confronted Freyda directly. Gunvor was a prosperous woman who had built her business through decades of careful cultivation of noble patrons, and she clearly saw Freyda's new role as a threat to the social boundaries that protected her own position. It's unseemly, Gunvor declared loudly enough for half the market to hear. A Jarl's daughter hawking ironwork like some common peddler. Have you no shame for your father's reputation? The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to be painful. Freyda was indeed using her connections and education in ways that challenged traditional expectations. But she was also discovering abilities and satisfactions she had never known she possessed. I have great pride in my father's reputation, Freyda replied carefully, aware that their exchange was being closely observed by dozens of potential customers and community members. And I believe he raised a daughter capable of contributing to her household's prosperity through honest work. Honest work, Gunvor scoffed. You mean trading on your bloodline to steal business from those who earned their positions through genuine effort? The challenge hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that extended far beyond a simple business dispute. This was about the nature of worth and merit, about whether value came from inherited status or demonstrated ability, about what kinds of changes their community was willing to accept. Before Freyda could respond, another voice entered the conversation. Astrid the Wise Woman, one of the settlement's most respected elders, stepped forward with the authority of someone whose opinions carried weight throughout the region. I've seen the contracts this young woman negotiates, Astrid said firmly. They're fair to all parties and written with clarity that prevents the disputes that have plagued our markets for years. If that's not honest work worthy of respect, then I don't understand what is. The endorsement from such a respected source shifted the dynamic of the confrontation, but Freyda could see that the underlying tensions remained unresolved. Her choice to marry Halvar had created ripples that were still spreading throughout their community, challenging assumptions and forcing people to reconsider beliefs they had never thought to question. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it the harsh reminder that survival in their northern climate required more than good intentions and warm feelings. As the first heavy snows blanketed Langfjord, the practical consequences of Freyda and Halvar's unconventional marriage became increasingly apparent and increasingly problematic. The troubles began when Eric received word that the alliance negotiations with the Hov clan had collapsed entirely. Gunnar, still smarting from his son's public humiliation, had allied instead with Jarl Thorstein of the Eastern Reaches, a man known for his aggressive expansion policies and his disdain for what he called weak leadership. The message was clear. Eric's failure to control his daughter had cost him a crucial political alliance and potentially exposed his people to future threats. Freyda learned of this development when her father arrived at the forge. On a grey morning when the wind carried the bite of coming storms, his usual composure was strained, and she could see the weight of leadership pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. "Father," she said, setting aside the account ledgers she had been reviewing, "what brings you here so early?" Eric's eyes swept over the modest cottage that had become his daughter's home, taking in the neat organization that spoke of contentment, if not prosperity. "We need to discuss the consequences of your choices, daughter. They extend far beyond your personal happiness." Halvar emerged from the forge, his leather apron still warm from the morning's work. He greeted Eric with respectful courtesy, but tension crackled between the two men, like sparks from heated metal. Both understood that their relationship existed in uncharted territory, complicated by affection, respect, and the political realities that couldn't be ignored. "The Hov alliance is finished," Eric said without preamble. "Gunnar has made it clear that any future negotiations must begin with correcting the insult his son believes he suffered." "Meaning?" Freyda asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Meaning he wants your marriage annulled, and Sigmund offered a proper bride from our household. Your cousin Thora has been suggested as a suitable replacement." The suggestion hit Freyda like a physical blow. Thora was barely 16, a sweet girl who still played with carved dolls and believed in fairy tales about handsome princes. The thought of sacrificing her to Sigmund's cruelty and pride made Freyda's stomach turn. "That's impossible," she said firmly. "I won't be party to destroying Thora's life to repair a political arrangement that was doomed from the moment Sigmund opened his mouth." Halvar stepped closer to his wife, not speaking, but making his support clear through proximity. Eric noticed the gesture and sighed deeply, the sound of a man caught between his duties as a father and his responsibilities as a leader. "I'm not asking you to agree," Eric said. "I'm informing you of the pressure I'm facing from my own advisors. Half of them believe I should have forced you to honor your original betrothal regardless of Sigmund's behavior. They see your defiance as a sign of weakness in my leadership." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Bjorn the Smith, Halvar's father, whose normally steady hands were trembling with anxiety. Behind him came Magnus the Skald and Astrid the Wise Woman, their expressions suggesting they bore news that would complicate an already difficult situation. "Jarl Eric," Magnus said formally, "we come with word from the outlying farms. 3 families have reported strange riders in the eastern hills, men who watch from distances but do not approach or identify themselves." Eric's expression hardened. Unknown riders during winter meant either desperate bandits or scouts from hostile clans, neither of which boded well for a community already facing political isolation. "How many riders?" Eric asked. "The reports vary," Astrid replied, "but at least a dozen, possibly more. They appear well-equipped and organized, not common thieves." The implications settled over the group like a cold fog. If Thorstein, or another ambitious Jarl, was considering aggressive action against Eric's weakened position, the coming winter could bring war instead of the peace they desperately needed to survive the harsh months ahead. "This changes things," Eric said grimly. "Political considerations become secondary when our people's safety is at stake." Freyda felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, the same burden she had carried since childhood. Her choices had contributed to their current vulnerability, and she couldn't ignore the potential consequences for everyone she cared about. "What would it take to repair the alliance with the Hov?" she asked quietly. "Freyda, no," Halvar said immediately, recognizing the direction of her thoughts. "You can't seriously be considering—" "I'm considering the welfare of our people," she interrupted, though the words felt like swallowing glass. "If my marriage is causing problems that could lead to bloodshed, your marriage," Eric said firmly, "is not the only factor at work here." Gunnar was already seeking ways to expand his influence, and Thorstein has been probing our borders for weaknesses since the poor harvests began. Your choice may have accelerated events, but it didn't create the underlying tensions. Magnus stepped forward, his weathered face thoughtful. "Perhaps there's another way to approach this situation. What if, instead of trying to repair old alliances, we focused on building new ones?" "Meaning?" Eric asked. "Meaning that other settlements have watched these events with interest. Not everyone approves of Gunnar's heavy-handed politics or Thorstein's aggressive expansion. There might be clans willing to ally with a leader who values loyalty and courage over mere convenience." Astrid nodded slowly. "The story of Halvar's bold offer and Freyda's brave choice has spread far beyond our borders. Some see it as a romantic tale, but others see it as evidence of a leadership that values honor over expedience." Freyda looked around the circle of faces, her father's weathered concern, her husband's steady determination, and the thoughtful expressions of people who had become far more than advisors. They were family, in the deepest sense of the word, bound together by shared values and mutual respect. "Then we build something new," she said finally. "Not by abandoning our principles, but by proving that doing the right thing can be its own kind of strength." The decision felt both frightening and liberating. They were choosing to move forward rather than backward, to create something better rather than simply restore what had been broken. But as she looked out at the snow beginning to fall more heavily, Freyda knew that winter would test their resolve in ways none of them could fully anticipate. The revelation came on a bitter morning when the fjord lay frozen under a grey sky that promised more snow. Freyda was working on correspondence with potential new allies when young Olaf burst through the cottage door. His face flushed with cold and excitement. "Lady Freyda," he gasped. Using the title that had become common among the younger residents, despite her changed status, "You must come quickly. There's been a discovery at the old watchtower, something that changes everything." Freyda exchanged glances with Halvar, who was sharpening tools by the fire. The old watchtower had been abandoned for decades, its stone walls slowly crumbling as newer defensive positions were built closer to the settlement. Whatever had been found there would have to be significant to warrant such urgency. They followed Olaf through the snow-covered paths to where a crowd had gathered around the ancient structure. Eric was already there, along with Magnus and several of the settlement's elders, all staring at something that had been unearthed from beneath the tower's collapsed northern wall. As they approached, Freyda could see what had captured everyone's attention: a wooden chest, its iron bindings green with age but still intact. The wood bore carved symbols that seemed familiar yet strange, runic inscriptions that predated the current generation's understanding of their own history. The chest was discovered when young Sven decided to use the old stones for his new house foundation, Eric explained, his voice carrying an odd mixture of excitement and uncertainty. "What we found inside—" He gestured to Magnus, who held a collection of objects wrapped in oiled leather. Magnus carefully unwrapped the largest item, a silver arm ring unlike any Freyda had ever seen. Where her family's heirloom bore 7 generations of wear and simple runic inscriptions, This ring was elaborately decorated with intricate knotwork and symbols that seemed to shift and change as the light played across their surfaces. "Read the inscription," Eric said quietly. Magnus held the ring closer to the firelight that had been brought to illuminate their examination. His weathered fingers traced the ancient runes as he slowly worked out their meaning. "To the line of Ericsson," he read, his voice growing stronger as the words became clear. "From Valdis the Wise, first among the mountain clans, let this token rest until the day comes when a daughter of our blood chooses love over gold, courage over comfort, truth over tradition. On that day, let her claim what was always meant to be hers, the right to lead not by inheritance alone, but by wisdom proven in the choosing." Silence fell over the assembled group as the implications of the inscription settled in their minds. Freyda felt her knees weaken as she stared at the ancient ring, understanding dawning like sunrise after the longest night. "Valdis the Wise," she whispered. "The same Valdis mentioned in our family stories?" "Your great-great-grandmother," Astrid confirmed, having arrived with several other women who had heard news of the discovery. "The one who supposedly vanished into the mountains after her husband's death, taking with her a fortune in silver and the loyalty of half the warrior bands in the region." Magnus continued unwrapping items from the chest, revealing a collection of objects that painted a picture none of them had expected. Silver coins bearing the marks of distant kingdoms, jeweled brooches that spoke of trade connections spanning continents, and most surprising of all, a collection of wooden tablets covered in runic writing that appeared to be detailed records of alliances, trade agreements and military strategies. "She didn't vanish," Eric said slowly, the pieces of an ancient puzzle falling into place. "She built something, a network of alliances and resources that she intended to pass down to her descendants when the time was right." Halvar stepped closer to examine the tablets, his practical mind immediately grasping their significance. "These aren't just historical records. They're blueprints, instructions for building the kind of regional confederation that could challenge any single Jarl's power." Magnus nodded, his excitement growing as he deciphered more of the ancient text. "Look at this, detailed maps of defensive positions, lists of clan leaders who could be trusted, even trade routes that would give economic independence from the coastal settlements." Freyda reached out with trembling fingers to touch the ornate arm ring. The moment her skin made contact with the ancient silver, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not magic, but recognition. This was what her dreams had been trying to tell her. Why she had always felt like she was meant for something more than simply marrying well and producing heirs. "The inscription mentions choice," she said thoughtfully. "Choosing love over gold, courage over comfort. It's as if she knew that someday one of her descendants would face exactly the decision I faced." "Perhaps she did," Astrid replied. "Valdis was called the Wise for good reason. She understood that real strength comes from building coalitions of willing allies, not forcing submission through fear and violence." Eric studied the documents with the keen eye of a leader who had spent decades navigating political complexities. "If these alliances still exist, if even half of these resources remain available," he trailed off. "But the implications were clear to everyone present. We wouldn't need the Hov alliance," Freyda finished. "We could build something stronger, more stable, based on mutual benefit rather than simple expedience." Magnus looked up from another tablet, his expression grave. "There's more. According to these records, Valdis foresaw the kind of threats we're facing. Now, ambitious Jarls using political marriages and economic pressure to build unsustainable power structures that would eventually collapse into chaos. She was preparing for war," Halvar observed, noting the detailed military planning evident in several documents. "No," Freyda said, understanding flooding through her as she studied the careful organization of Valdis's plans. She was preparing to prevent war. All of this, the alliances, the trade networks, the defensive strategies, it's designed to make aggression economically and militarily impossible. The ancient chest had contained more than historical artifacts. It held the blueprint for a completely different approach to regional politics. one that could transform their current crisis into an opportunity to build something unprecedented in their time and place. But as Freyda lifted the ornate arm ring, feeling its weight and significance, she also understood the enormous responsibility she was accepting. Valdis had left these tools for her descendant to use, but success would require skills, courage, and wisdom that went far beyond anything her noble education had prepared her for. The mysterious riders, Eric said suddenly, connecting pieces of information with the clarity that had made him a successful leader. If word has spread about our discovery, others might already know about Valdis's legacy. They could be here to prevent us from claiming what she left behind. The thought sent a chill through the assembled group that had nothing to do with the winter cold. If hostile forces knew about the ancient alliance network and saw it as a threat to their own ambitions, then the coming conflict would be about far more than a broken marriage agreement or territorial disputes. Then we need to move quickly, Freyda said, sliding the ancient arm ring onto her wrist beside her family's traditional heirloom. The contrast between the two bands seemed to symbolize the choice between old limitations and new possibilities. If Valdis left us the tools to build a different future, then we owe it to our people and to her memory to use them. As the group began to carefully collect the remaining artifacts from the chest, Freyda felt the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a cloak. Her choice to marry for love rather than duty had seemed like a personal decision, but it was revealing itself to be part of a much larger pattern, one that had been set in motion generations before her birth. The question now was whether she possessed the strength and wisdom to fulfill the legacy Valdis the Wise had entrusted to her. Bloodline. The War Council convened at dawn in Eric's great hall, but this was unlike any gathering the settlement had ever witnessed. Instead of the usual collection of sworn warriors and trusted advisors, the assembly included craftsmen, traders, wise women, and even several of the more prosperous farmers. Valdis's legacy had taught them that true strength came from unity across all levels of society, not just the traditional warrior elite. Freyda stood before the gathered assembly wearing both arm rings, her family's traditional silver band, and Valdis's ornate ancient ring. The contrast between them seemed to embody the transformation taking place in their community, honoring the past while embracing a radically different future. The riders have been identified, Eric announced, his voice carrying the gravity of confirmed fears. Scouts report at least 30 armed men camped in the eastern hills, flying the banners of both Thorstein's clan and mercenary companies from across the northern seas. They're not here for negotiation. Magnus stepped forward, carrying several of Valdis's ancient tablets. His weathered hands trembled slightly. Whether from age or excitement, no one could tell. I've spent the night translating more of the old records. The alliance network Valdis established extends farther than we initially understood. Clans as distant as the Western Isles pledged mutual support under her confederation. How many of those alliances might still be honored? Asked Bjorn the smith, speaking for the craftsmen who had the most to lose if their settlement fell to raiders. Unknown, Magnus admitted. But the protocols Valdis established were designed to survive generations of political change. The call for aid follows ancient patterns that transcend individual clan loyalties. Halvar studied the detailed maps Valdis had left behind, his practical mind working through logistics and defensive possibilities. These defensive positions she marked, most of them are still viable. The geography hasn't changed, and several of the old signal fires could be rebuilt within days. Signal fires won't matter if we don't have allies to receive the signals, pointed out Gunvor the Weaver. Her earlier antagonism toward Freyda apparently set aside in the face of external threats. Freyda moved to the center of the hall, feeling the weight of every gaze upon her. The decision they faced would determine not just their immediate survival, but the kind of community they would become. Valdis's legacy offered them tools, but success would require courage that went beyond anything they had previously imagined. "We send the call," she said firmly. If even half of the old alliances respond, we'll have enough support to discourage Thorstein's aggression. If they don't respond, we'll face the same fight we would have faced anyway, but we'll know we tried to build something better." Eric nodded slowly, understanding the wisdom in his daughter's reasoning. "And if the call brings more enemies than allies? Some clans might see Valdis's return as a threat to their own ambitions. Then we learn who our true allies are," Astrid said, entering the conversation with the authority of a woman who had helped navigate decades of political complexity. Sometimes clarity is worth more than comfortable uncertainty. The next hours passed in a whirlwind of preparation that touched every aspect of their community's life. The signal fires Valdis had mapped were rebuilt and stocked with the specific combinations of wood and herbs that would send coded messages across vast distances. Riders were dispatched along ancient routes carrying formal calls for aid written in the traditional language of alliance obligations. Freyda found herself at the center of activities that seemed to blur the lines between practical planning and something approaching ancient ritual. Valdis had understood that leadership required both strategic thinking and symbolic meaning, and her legacy included detailed instructions for ceremonies that would legitimize the activation of dormant alliances. The ancient ring must be worn during all formal communications, Magnus explained as he helped Freyda prepare for the most crucial task, personally delivering alliance calls to the 3 nearest clan leaders who might still honor Valdis's confederation. It serves as both identification and proof of legitimate authority. Halvar checked the weapons and tools. They would carry on what promised to be a dangerous journey through territory that might already be controlled by hostile forces. His new status as husband to a Jarl's daughter had thrust him into responsibilities he had never sought. But he faced them with the same steady competence he brought to his forge work. "You don't have to come with me," Freyda said, as she watched him test the edge of a newly sharpened sword. "This isn't your burden to bear." "It became my burden the moment I chose to stand with you," he replied, without looking up from his preparations. "Besides, you'll need someone who understands the practical side of alliance negotiations, trade agreements, resource sharing, the details that make political promises workable." Their first destination was the settlement of Jarl Orm the Just, a leader whose reputation for fairness had survived 3 decades of regional political upheaval. According to Valdis's records, his grandfather had been one of the original Confederation members, and the alliance obligations should still be binding on his descendants. The journey through snow-covered hills required careful navigation to avoid the areas where Thorstein's scouts had been reported. Freyda and Halvar traveled with a small escort of Eric's most trusted warriors, moving quickly but cautiously through terrain that offered both protection and danger. As they rode, Freyda found herself thinking about the transformation that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a dutiful daughter preparing for a marriage that would secure her father's political position. Now she was carrying the hopes of an entire community while attempting to revive an alliance system that had been dormant for generations. "Are you having second thoughts?" Halvar asked during a brief rest stop, echoing the question he had posed on their wedding day. "About which part?" Freyda replied, managing a smile despite the gravity of their situation. "Marrying you, activating ancient alliances, or trying to prevent a war?" "Any of it." "All of it." She considered the question seriously, looking out over the winter landscape that had shaped generations of her ancestors. "I keep thinking about Valdis and the choices she made. She could have accepted the traditional role expected of her, or she could have used her position to grab immediate power for herself. Instead, she chose to build something that would outlast her own lifetime. That's not really an answer to my question." "It is, though." Freyda turned to face him directly. "Every choice I've made since our wedding has been about building rather than preserving, creating rather than inheriting. I don't know if we'll succeed, but I know we're trying to become something better than what we were." Their conversation was interrupted by the appearance of a lone rider approaching from the direction of Orm's settlement. The man carried a white banner, indicating peaceful intentions. But his urgent pace suggested news that couldn't wait for formal diplomatic protocols. "Lady Freyda," the rider called as he drew near. "I bring word from Jarl Orm. He received your signal fires and sends his immediate response." Freyda felt her heart racing as she accepted the message scroll. Everything they had planned depended on whether the ancient alliances could be revived, whether Valdis's vision could bridge the gap between past promises and present needs. The message was brief but transformative. The bonds forged by Valdis the Wise remain unbroken. Orm the Just pledges his sword, his gold, and his honor to the Confederation. 200 warriors ride at dawn. As word of Orm's response spread through their small party, Freyda felt something shift in the atmosphere around them. They were no longer desperate refugees hoping to avoid a conflict. They were the advance guard of a coalition that might genuinely challenge the aggressive expansion that threatened their entire region. But even as hope began to replace fear, she understood that success would bring its own dangers. If Valdis's confederation could be revived, it would fundamentally alter the balance of power throughout the northern territories. Some would see this as salvation, but others would view it as an intolerable threat to their own ambitions. The real test was yet to come. The confrontation came at midday, when the winter sun hung pale and distant in a sky the color of polished steel. Freyda stood atop the ancient watchtower where Valdis's legacy had been discovered, watching as three separate forces converged on the valley below. To the east, Thorstein's mercenaries advanced in disciplined formations, their weapons glinting in the cold light. From the west came Orm's promised warriors, their banners bright against the snow. And from the north, a surprise that changed everything, Gunnar and Sigmund of Hov, leading a force that could tip the balance in either direction. "They've come to claim Valdis's treasure for themselves," Eric observed grimly, studying the approaching armies through the spyglass Magnus had found among the ancient artifacts. "Gunnar must believe that controlling the Confederation's resources will secure his dominance over the entire region." Freyda touched the ornate arm ring that had become both symbol and burden, feeling the weight of decisions that would reshape their world. Below them, the settlement buzzed with activity as final preparations were made for what might become the most significant battle their people had ever faced. "No," she said quietly, understanding dawning like sunrise after storm. "Look at their formation, their approach routes. If Gunnar wanted to claim the treasure, he would have attacked at dawn when we were unprepared. They're positioning themselves as mediators, not aggressors." Halvar joined them on the tower, carrying the ancient war horn that Valdis had left as part of her legacy. The instrument was carved from mammoth tusk and decorated with silver bands that caught the light like captured stars. According to the old records, its sound could carry across vast distances, calling allies to battle or enemies to parley. "The question is whether to sound the call for war or the call for counsel," he said, weighing the horn in his hands like a smith testing the balance of a new blade. Before anyone could respond, a new banner appeared on the southern ridge, the raven standard of Jarl Astrid Iron Hand, a legendary warrior woman whose reputation for both fierceness and fairness had spread throughout the northern territories. Her arrival meant that word of the Confederation's revival had traveled farther and faster than anyone had anticipated. 4 armies, Magnus breathed, his weathered face pale with the magnitude of what they were witnessing. "This is how legends are born, or how civilizations end." Freyda closed her eyes and tried to channel the wisdom of her ancestress, seeking guidance from a woman who had faced similar choices generations before. When she opened them again, her decision was clear. "Sound the call for counsel," she commanded. If Valdis intended this confederation to prevent war rather than cause it, then we honor her vision by choosing negotiation over bloodshed. The ancient horn's voice rolled across the valley like thunder, its deep tones carrying meanings that transcended language. Those who knew the old ways understood immediately. This was not a challenge to battle, but an invitation to something rarer and more difficult than warfare, the chance to build peace through strength rather than impose it through conquest. One by one, the approaching armies halted their advance. Banners were planted in the snow as temporary camps were established, creating a rough circle around the central settlement with clear sightlines between all parties. The message was unmistakable. Everyone present was committed to talking before fighting, but ready for either possibility. As the leaders of each force rode forward for the council meeting, Freyda felt the full weight of what Valdis had entrusted to her bloodline. This was not just about preventing one battle or resolving one conflict. This was about demonstrating that there could be alternatives to the endless cycle of raid and revenge that had defined their region for generations. Eric placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder, his touch carrying both pride and concern. "Are you ready for this? Once you speak as leader of the Confederation, there's no returning to the simpler life you've built with Halvar." She looked down at the cottage where she had found unexpected happiness, at the forge where her husband worked with quiet skill, at the community that had learned to accept her unconventional choices. All of it would change if she succeeded in reviving Valdis's legacy, but all of it would be destroyed if she failed. "I was never meant for a simple life," she replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Valdis knew that when she left her legacy for someone who would choose love over gold. She understood that real love sometimes requires the courage to risk everything you've built for the possibility of something better. As the council preparations began below, Freyda descended from the tower wearing both arm rings and carrying herself with the quiet authority that had been building since her wedding day. The scared young woman who had faced public humiliation had transformed into something none of them had expected, a leader worthy of the legacy she had inherited. The great council convened in a circle of banners planted in the snow, each representing not just military force, but generations of pride, ambition, and carefully guarded independence. Freyda walked into that circle, knowing that the next hour would determine whether Valdis's vision of unity could overcome centuries of division and mistrust. Thorstein of the Eastern Reaches spoke first, his voice carrying the harsh confidence of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted. "I came here expecting to crush a weakened clan. Instead, I find myself facing the ghost of Valdis the Wise and her impossible dreams of confederation. But ghosts cannot lead armies, and dreams cannot feed warriors. And yet here you are," Freyda replied calmly, "talking instead of fighting. Perhaps ghosts and dreams have more power than you realize." Gunnar of Hov stepped forward, his weathered face revealing the calculating intelligence that had built his wealth and influence. "The question is not whether Valdis's confederation can be revived, but whether it should be. Such power concentrated in any single leadership could threaten the independence of every clan in the region, including your own," observed Astrid Ironhand, her scarred hands resting casually on her sword hilt. "Which is why you've brought your son and his warriors, not to support the confederation, but to ensure you control it." Sigmund's face flushed with anger at the implication, but before he could respond, Orm the Just raised his hand for silence. His reputation for wisdom had not been earned through passionate speeches, but through careful listening and thoughtful judgment. "We debate the wrong question," Orm said quietly. "The Confederation exists whether we acknowledge it or not. The bonds Valdis forged were not broken by time or neglect. They were simply dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken. That moment has come." He gestured toward Freyda, his eyes taking in both the ancient ring that marked her as Valdis's heir and the simple iron band that represented her choice to marry for love rather than advantage. "This woman has proven herself worthy of the legacy she carries. The question is whether we are worthy of the opportunity she offers." Freyda felt the moment crystallizing around her, understanding that everything depended on her ability to articulate a vision that could unite these proud, suspicious leaders around something greater than their individual ambitions. Valdis left us more than ancient alliances and buried treasure. she began, her voice carrying clearly across the circle despite the wind that had begun to howl down from the mountains. She left us a choice between two different futures. In one, we continue the patterns that have defined our ancestors. Raid and revenge, temporary alliances that crumble when convenience demands. Strength measured only by our ability to take from others. She paused, looking each leader in the eyes before continuing. In the other, we build something that outlasts our individual lives, a confederation where strength comes from mutual support, where prosperity is shared rather than hoarded, where our children inherit peace instead of endless conflict. Thorstein's laugh was harsh and dismissive. Beautiful words, but the world is not changed by speeches. The strong take what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. That is the natural order, is it? Halvar stepped forward, his presence a reminder that this council included voices beyond the traditional warrior nobility. In my forge, I've learned that the strongest metal comes not from pure iron, but from carefully balanced alloys. Each element contributes something different, and the result is stronger than any single component could be alone. Astrid Ironhand nodded slowly, understanding the metaphor's deeper meaning. A confederation of willing allies versus a collection of conquered territories. One builds strength through cooperation, the other through coercion. And which do you believe will prove more durable? Freyda asked, directing the question toward Gunnar, whose political instincts were sharp enough to recognize the truth in what she was proposing. The older Jarl considered carefully before responding. History suggests that empires built on conquest eventually fall to internal rebellion or external invasion. But confederations... He trailed off, his mind working through implications and possibilities. Confederations require trust, Sigmund interjected, his voice carrying the bitter edge of wounded pride. And trust requires respect. Why should any of us trust a woman who abandoned her duty for the sake of her own desires? Because, Freyda replied with quiet dignity, abandoning duty to follow my heart taught me the difference between blind obedience and conscious choice. A confederation built on conscious choice will always be stronger than one built on obligation alone. She removed Valdis's ring from her wrist and held it up so that its ancient silver caught the pale sunlight. This ring has waited generations for someone worthy to claim its legacy. Not someone born to the right bloodline or married to the right alliance, but someone willing to choose courage over convenience, unity over division. And if we refuse your vision? Thorstein asked, his hand moving toward his weapon. Then you return to your territories, and we return to ours, Freyda replied simply. But the Confederation will continue to grow, one willing ally at a time, until it encompasses everyone ready to choose cooperation over conquest. The challenge hung in the cold air between them, pregnant with possibilities that could reshape their entire world. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of renewal that seemed to mirror the transformation taking place throughout the northern territories. Freyda stood once again at her cottage window, but now the view encompassed more than just the familiar settlement of Langfjord. Delegations from a dozen allied clans had established semi-permanent camps in the surrounding valleys, creating a bustling center of trade and diplomacy that would have been unimaginable just months before. The Great Council had ended not with dramatic declarations or sword-sworn oaths, but with the quiet recognition that Valdis's vision offered something all of them needed: stability in an increasingly uncertain world. Thorstein had withdrawn his forces, choosing neutrality over opposition when it became clear that the Confederation commanded genuine support. Gunnar and Sigmund had negotiated entry terms that preserved their autonomy while acknowledging the benefits of collective security. Even some of the Danish raiders who had plagued their coasts sent envoys inquiring about trade agreements rather than planning raids. The morning reports, Halvar said, entering their home with a collection of wooden tablets that had become part of their daily routine. His role had evolved far beyond that of village blacksmith. He now served as one of the Confederation's primary coordinators, using his practical skills to ensure that noble intentions translated into workable realities. Freyda accepted the reports while adjusting Valdis's ring, which had become as natural a part of her daily wear as her simple iron wedding band. The contrast between them no longer seemed jarring. Instead, they represented the successful integration of inherited responsibility and chosen love. Grain shipments from Orm's territory arrived yesterday, Halvar continued, and the fishing fleets report that coordinated patrols have eliminated piracy along the northern routes. Trade volume is up 40% from last year. And the difficult news? Freyda asked, knowing from his expression that not all developments had been positive. Border tensions with Jarl Ragnar's holdings. He's testing our commitment to mutual defense by raiding settlements just outside our territory. If we respond, we risk being seen as aggressors. If we don't, we appear weak. Freyda nodded, unsurprised by the challenge. Building a confederation based on cooperation rather than conquest required constant vigilance and careful judgment. Every decision set precedents that would influence future generations, just as Valdis's choices had shaped the possibilities available to them. Schedule a council meeting for next week, she decided. This is exactly the kind of decision that should be made collectively rather than unilaterally. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Not the harsh sounds of conflict, but the excited voices of people gathering to witness something significant. Through the window, they could see a familiar figure approaching along the main path, Magnus the Skald, his aged frame somehow radiating the energy of a man with important news to share. "Lady Freyda," Magnus called as they emerged from their cottage, "you must hear what the southern traders have brought us. News that changes our understanding of everything we've accomplished." The trader delegation proved to be more than simple merchants. Their leader, a weathered woman named Ingrid Shipheart, bore the scars and bearing of someone who had sailed the far seas and negotiated with distant kingdoms. Her cargo included not just exotic goods, but information about political developments throughout the northern world. "Word of your confederation has spread farther than you might imagine," Ingrid explained as they gathered in Eric's great hall. "The southern kingdoms watch your experiment with great interest. Some fear it as a threat to their own expansion plans, but others see it as a model worth emulating." She produced a leather scroll bearing official seals that marked it as a formal diplomatic communication. "King Harold of the Southern Reach sends greetings to the Northern Confederation and proposes a treaty of mutual recognition and trade." The implications settled over the assembled council like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Official recognition from established kingdoms would transform their confederation from a regional experiment into a legitimate political entity with standing in the wider world. "There's more," Ingrid continued, her expression suggesting that the most significant news was yet to come. "Other regions have begun forming their own confederations, using your success as inspiration. What you've built here isn't just solving local problems, it's offering a new model for how communities can organize themselves." Freyda felt the weight of Valdis's legacy settling around her in a new way. Her ancestress had not simply planned for the survival of a single clan or even a single region. She had planted seeds that were now growing into something that could reshape the political landscape of their entire world. That evening, as the celebrations wound down and the last of the visiting delegations settled into their temporary quarters, Freyda and Halvar walked together through the settlement that had become the heart of something unprecedented. Children played between the houses with the casual confidence of young people who had never known the constant fear of raid and reprisal. Craftsmen worked alongside nobles, their skills valued equally in the cooperative framework they had built. "Do you ever regret it?" Halvar asked, echoing the question that had become their private tradition. "The simple life we thought we were choosing?" Freyda smiled, her hand finding his in the gathering dusk. We did choose a simple life. We just didn't realize that sometimes simple truths require complex applications. She looked up at the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, thinking of Valdis and all the women who had worn these rings before her, carrying forward dreams of something better than what they had inherited. The red wedding gown that had once marked her humiliation now hung in their cottage as a reminder of how completely their world had changed. Besides, she added, leaning into the warmth of her husband's presence, what could be simpler than choosing love over fear, cooperation over conquest, hope over resignation? Everything else just follows naturally from those basic decisions. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, bearing witness to another generation that had chosen to build rather than destroy, to unite rather than divide, to trust in the possibility that tomorrow could be better than today. And in the warmth of their shared contentment, the future seemed as bright and full of promise as the spring dawn that would soon break over their transformed world.